So what are the basic components of a human mind? We need systems for allowing us to attend to our world so we can perceive our world. We need systems that allow us to act in our world to drive complex movements. We need memory systems so that learning and experiences are maintained in the brain. But I would argue that we also need the faculty of language. Language really sets the human mind apart from non-human animals. And because of that, it's an entire field in psychology known as psycholinguistics. So what I'm going to do over the next two lectures is just give you a very brief introduction to the psychology of language, to linguistics and psycholinguistics. There's actually an entire course here at Acadia called psycholinguistics that you can take. It is sort of its own field within psychology because language arguably, is the thing that makes us human. And I'll get into, why that is in this lecture. So what is language? How do we define language? Many textbooks just don't define language. They consider it either obvious or just too complicated. But simply put, language is a system of sounds, symbols, and gestures used to express thoughts or ideas. Critically, language is not speech. Speech is the means by which we communicate using language, I should say. But there are other ways to do this, right? We can write things down. We can use signs, right? Speak using American Sign Language. So language is separate from the method that we use to communicate using language. Generally speaking, the most common method is by producing speech, but there are other methods. So that's something to keep in mind. In the 1960s, Charles Hockett, an anthropologist and linguist, decided to sort of lay out what he thought were 13 design features of human language. And it was his attempt to sort of map out how human language is different from other forms of communication that we see in non-human animals. And I won't go through all 13, but I'm just going to look at 5 that arguably set human language apart from communicative systems that we see in non-human animals. So the first is semanticity. There's a relationship between the signs that we use, so linguistic symbols, could be gestures, could be words written on a page or produced spoken words, and the things that they refer to. So language symbols have meaning. And what's important here is that if I say the word bird, right, this brings to mind that image. Right? As soon as I say the word, you're thinking about a bird. You're picturing it. You know how to use that word in a sentence. You know things that tend to go with birds, right? Flying, trees, nests. So there's a relationship between signs and the things that they refer to. Second important principle, discreteness. We have distinct symbols for distinct concepts, right? Pear versus bear. Superficially, very similar words. They differ by one letter. But the things they refer to are dramatically different, right? Pear, tasty fruit. Bear, a big creature that you do not want to encounter by yourself in the woods. So distinct symbols for distinct concepts. These symbols are arbitrary. There's no resemblance between, the word bear and what a bear looks like, or the word pear and what a pear looks like. If there was a resemblance, those two things would arguably be quite similar because the two words are quite similar, right? So the signs that we use are arbitrary with a few exceptions. There's always onomatopoeia, right? So these are words that sort of sound like the thing they refer to. So like boom, for instance, is an example, but very few exceptions. Generally speaking, the signs and symbols that we use to communicate using language are arbitrary. Fourth principle, displacement. We use language to communicate about things that are not physically present. And this, you do not see this at all in non-human communicative systems. Generally speaking, non-human animals that have some sort of communication system, they do it in response to environmental stimuli, right? They see a tiger and they make the call for tiger. They see food and they make the call for food. We use language all the time to talk about things that have happened in the past and things that might happen in the future. And this is, incredible. It allows us to plan ahead and to record our history. It's a super important aspect of language. Fifth design principle, arguably the most important, productivity. So there are a set of rules that we all know. So these are the rules of grammar that allow us to combine the symbols of language in a limitless number of ways. So the symbols themselves, right, are finite. There are only, a certain number of letters in the alphabet. We only know, a finite number of words. But with those symbols, we can create an infinite number of ideas. This is remarkably useful, right? It means that I can say a sentence to you that you've never heard before, and you will immediately understand it because you know the rules of grammar, because you can, as we would say, parse that sentence. You can extract meaning from this thing that you've never actually encountered before. It also means that because we use language to think, which is true, we all have this internal monologue, most people do anyways, have this internal monologue in their heads. It means that, there's really no limit on the types of thoughts that we can have. So productivity, very important part of language, very important aspect of language that we just don't see this in communication systems in animals. Very simple example, productivity. I can say Molly went to the shirt store and effortlessly add some more information to that sentence, right? Molly with the brown hair went to the shirt store. That was totally effortless. You understood that, no problem. I'm adding some more information. I could do this over and over and over again. This is called recursion. I can insert one idea within another. And so it allows us to really generate an infinite number of ideas. There's no restriction in terms of the thoughts that we can have when we're thinking in language and using language. So if we look at animal communication systems, we see that they don't really meet the definition of language as laid out by Hawken. So sometimes the way language use is studied in non-human animals is by training apes, gorillas, to use sign language. And the idea here is to see, well, maybe any non-human animal can learn language. They just have to be trained. They have to be raised as a human child would be raised. And there are indeed, cases of chimpanzees being raised, with human parents. And what we see is that these animals just don't use the signs that they learn in a language-like way. So they may learn a bunch of signs, right? Like, 50, 60 signs, so 50, 60 different words. They rarely combine those signs in a unique way to create unique ideas. Typically, they're using the signs to ask for things, right? To ask for food, for instance. One issue with these studies is that experimenter bias can play a huge role. So if you've, spent 5-10 years of your life training a chimpanzee to sign, you might feel like you have this connection with the animal and that, they're really talking to you. But there's just really no evidence that they can combine the signs that they've learned in a unique way to create an infinite number of ideas. The other way that we study communication systems in non-human animals is by looking at animals which have complicated sort of alarm call systems. So the Diana monkey of West Africa is one of these animals. It makes distinct calls in response to leopards and eagles. And so basically, if a Diana monkey sees a leopard, it makes one call. And the idea here is it's kind of like telling, everybody in the troop to run up the tree. If they see an eagle, they make another call. It's kind of like telling everybody to come down from the trees. And I'll just play you an example of what this sounds like. And so you might think, why is this not language? They have these arbitrary calls that refer to, things in their world. It's not language because they're only producing these calls, right, in response to the sight or sound or smell of one of these predators, right? So it's kind of like a stimulus response type behavior. They're not using these calls to talk about what could happen in the future, for instance, or what did happen in the past. The other thing they're not doing is combining these calls in unique ways to make new calls. So there doesn't seem to be any sort of, rule that they have for combining new sounds to refer to new things in their world. It's also unclear whether, if a Diana monkey hears the eagle alarm call, does that actually bring to mind the idea of an eagle? That's unclear, and this is, attempts have been made to study this, but it's unclear. And so what could be happening here is that the animals are simply responding in sort of like a conditioned way, right? You hear a particular noise, and you've just learned that means run down the tree or run up the tree. It doesn't actually bring to mind the thing that the call is meant to refer to. So those are just a couple critiques of sort of communicative systems in animals. And once in a while, you'll listen to some podcast and they'll talk about how groundhogs have their own language or whatever. Prairie dogs, that's a popular one, the prairie dog language. And again, what you have to ask yourself is, is there any evidence that they can combine these arbitrary calls at will, okay, to create something new, to create a new idea, to express a new thought. And so far, we haven't encountered any communicative system in animals that allows for that. And I just want to reinforce how beneficial that is, right? That we can do this. That right now I'm producing sentences that I've never produced before in my life. You're understanding them, right? It's super useful, and it really, allows us to have complex thoughts. So let's talk a bit about language development. Something that is quite clear is that human brains want to learn language. So if you're exposed to language early in life, you will learn language. You just have to be exposed to it. There's enough evidence, I think, now to say that, our brains are wired. There's some innate circuitry there that allows us to very, very quickly learn this very, very complex thing. And as we've discussed, earlier on in the course, this can't be explained through, for instance, conditioning, learned associations. There's something more here, because children are often producing, sentences they've never heard an adult produce before. There is a critical period, so you need to be exposed to language, before about the age 8 or 9. And there are a few very rare cases of children who were raised in complete isolation, and it leads to basically an impairment in their ability to learn language. This critical period is a little bit different from a critical period that exists for learning a second language, right? So you may have noticed that it's harder to learn a second language later in life, and people who learn a second language later in life tend to speak it with an accent. And people who are fluent bilinguals tend to be raised in a bilingual environment. And so there is this other critical period that refers to learning a second language, and that's actually a little bit longer. So it looks like sort of, that spans to about 18 or 19. And then after that age, you can still learn a second language or a third language or a fourth language. You're probably just going to speak it with a bit of an accent. So children just need to be exposed to language, to learn language, and we see them acquire language in very stereotyped phases. So there's a babbling phase, there's a word production phase, and then there's a sentence production phase. And although there are many different languages around the world, and some are more complex than others, there isn't a single culture that we've encountered, human culture that we've encountered, that doesn't have language in some form. So human brains also seem wired to support language, right? And we've looked at a few historical cases. So Paul Broca's famous patient who had damage in the left frontal lobe was unable to produce speech. Carl Wernicke's famous patient who had damage in the left temporal lobe, unable to perceive language, I should say. And again, for Broca's area, it's not just producing speech; it's producing language. So his patient wouldn't have been able to, for instance, sign. So we see that there seem to be brain areas that support the use of both the production and the perception of language. And there's actually a term for people who suffer brain damage that results in an impairment of the linguistic system, so an impairment in their ability to learn to use language, and we call that aphasia. So we see either production aphasia, right, the inability to produce language, perception aphasia or reception aphasia, the inability to perceive language, and sometimes it's even worse than that, so some patients lose both. Now the image on the screen shows an older model of the neurobiology of language in the brain. And the general idea here is that you've got an area that's involved in language perception, an area that's involved in language production, connections between the two areas. Now, we actually think that the model is a bit more complicated, and it's actually based on dual stream models. So if you remember from vision, there's this dual stream model of visual processing. In language and speech processing, there's a dual stream model as well that has a dorsal stream and a ventral stream. The dorsal stream is thought to be the sound to action stream, so it's important for mapping sounds onto action, so producing speech, whereas the ventral stream is the sound to meaning stream, so it's important for extracting meaning from the speech that you hear. So this would be, the speech comprehension stream. So there's like a production stream and a comprehension stream. You're not going to have to know the details of this fairly complex model, but it is important to note that we do see this dual stream architecture just like we see in visual processing. And we do see, areas of the brain that seem to be, to some extent, specialized for language. And then, the larger sort of, if you zoom out, right, we can also say that the left hemisphere is specialized for language because we tend to see that in most people, language is lateralized to the left hemisphere. So if we're going to talk about psycholinguistics, it's worth just defining, first of all, linguistics, which is, of course, an area, a field of study, I should say, that we don't offer at Acadia. It's quite rare, actually, these days to find universities with linguistic departments. But linguistics is the study of language and its structure, sort of without care to human behavior. So you're sort of just like studying languages to know about, how language works, not necessarily how language is used. And that's sort of the difference between linguistics and psycholinguistics. But we can break linguistics down into basically 6 major domains: phonology, semantics, phonetics, pragmatics, morphology, and syntax. And I'm just going to go through each of these very, very quickly, just so that you have some background on what these words mean, because you may encounter them if you go on to take further courses in psychology or take psycholinguistics here at Acadia. On the screen, we can see Noam Chomsky, probably the most famous linguist. If you recall, he was famous in cognitive psychology for sort of arguing against Skinner's notion that language could be acquired through conditioning. As Chomsky, nicely showed, language is just too complicated, and children acquire it too quickly to explain language acquisition by drawing on conditioning. There's something more happening there. It seems to be sort of hardwired into our brains. So let's go through the different fields of linguistics. Phonology is concerned with organizing the sounds or signs of language, right? So in speech, we talk about how sounds are grouped together into units called phonemes. Phonemes are perceptually distinct units of sound in a language like consonants and vowels. That's the easiest way to describe a phoneme, a consonant or a vowel. Pot versus spot, right? The P sound in each of those words. Acoustically, the P sound in each of those words is distinct, but we say it's the same phoneme. So phonemes are sets of speech sounds that are perceived as equivalent to each other, even if they might differ in terms of their acoustics. Phonetics is concerned with how speech sounds are physically produced. So, what am I doing right now to produce vowels, to produce consonants? How do I change the pitch of my voice, for instance? And phonetics is also concerned with how speech is perceived, which is a very, as we've learned in this course, it's a very tricky problem, right? Because of issues with segmenting words and issues of variability in speech signals, right? Different speakers talk in different ways. How does your brain extract the same meaning from an acoustical signal that can be quite variable from one speaker to the next? This is why, as we discussed earlier on in the course, designing speech recognition systems like an Amazon Alexa is a very, very challenging problem. Yet our brains do it quite easily. Semantics is the study of how we derive meaning from words. Right? So words are contained in what we call the lexicon. You can think of the lexicon as a big mental dictionary. And so when I say the word bird, what you're doing is you're extracting that word from your mental dictionary, and it's kind of like looking it up. You get, you understand suddenly everything about that word, right? You can not only picture the animal, but you know how to use that word in a sentence. You know what things relate to that word. And so there's a whole area of psycholinguistics that's concerned with how the lexicon is organized. Like, how are words organized in our mental dictionary? right? Are words that we use more frequently easier to access, for instance? Lots of people have studied this idea. Pragmatics attempts to explain how language users overcome ambiguity. So we've already looked at some cases of linguistic ambiguity in this course, right? He threw stones at the bank. What kind of bank are we referring to here? A bank that holds money or a river bank? We saw her duck. Was she ducking to avoid the stones being thrown at her, or was she, was it her duck, her pet duck? Right, there's some ambiguity here, and so pragmatics is interested in how that's solved, how we solve these problems to understand, the meaning of a sentence. Morphology is a study of words and how they're formed. So, for instance, pluralizations, putting words into their past tense form. People who study morphology are often concerned with morphemes, which are the smallest meaningful units in a language. Phonemes, which I defined in a previous slide, are the smallest meaningless units. So consonants and vowels, on their own, they have no meaning. Morphemes are the smallest units of a language that have meaning. So these tend to be words, but they can also be word endings, right? The ending ed, that carries some meaning. So we consider that a morpheme on its own. Pluralizations, like adding s to a word, that carries some meaning, and so we consider pluralizations a morpheme. So like dog is one morpheme, and dogs consists of two morphemes. And so morphology, again, is just the study of how words are formed. If morphology is a study of words and word form, syntax is how we combine words together into sentences. The rules that allow us to do this, and how when we read a sentence we understand it. We extract meaning from it, how we parse it. Syntax is not to be confused with grammar. So grammar encompasses both syntax and morphology. Grammar refers to the rules that govern all aspects of a language. So people who study syntax might look at a sentence and break it down into its constituent parts using what's called a parse tree, which is what you can see on the screen here, right? So all sentences must have a noun phrase and a verb phrase, for instance. And so you can break a sentence down into its various parts, which have been combined in sort of a rule-based way. Psycholinguistics, the psychology of language, is the study of the relationship between human behavior, psychology, and linguistics, right? So again, whereas linguists are interested in sort of language generally, the makeup of languages, how words are combined in languages, how languages differ, psycholinguists are interested in how linguistics interacts with psychology or shapes our psychology. And so major concerns in the field consist of, how do we perceive spoken, written, and sign language? How is language represented in the brain, so the neurobiology of language? How do we produce language? That's what I study. And then how do we learn language as children or as second language learners? So developmental psychologists often study language learning. Okay, we've come to the lecture review. Question 1. In relation to Hockett's design features of language, what is productivity? In relation to Hockett's design features of language, what is productivity? So productivity is the idea that language allows us to produce an infinite number of thoughts and ideas at will. And again, I would argue that this property of language really sets human language apart from other communicative systems that animals might use. Question 2, what brain areas support language? So maybe think about this in terms of, first of all, what hemisphere supports language, and then what 2 brain areas were discussed in this lecture. So question 2, what brain areas support language? There are many brain areas in the left hemisphere, but historically we like to think of Broca's area and Wernicke's area as supporting the production and the perception of language, although it can get quite more complex than that. But for the purposes of this course, you can think of those areas as, languagey areas. Question 3, what are the 6 major divisions of linguistics? What are the 6 major divisions of linguistics? Phonology, phonetics, semantics, pragmatics, morphology, and syntax.